welcome to Policy and Politics with me, Tarun Nangia. India has achieved another milestone in its exports journey. Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal acquainted us with this fact that India reached the milestone of exporting merchandise export worth $400 billion in March earlier this year. And of course, we reached that target well before the target date of March 30. That is an achievement. And he also said and urged that India can achieve a target of $1 trillion merchandise exports in the next 6-7 years. He also hailed that India has a great success as a service exporter, but he said that any nation to be developed has to get about 25-26% of its exports, in a sense, from manufacturing. So manufacturing should constitute 25% of your economy, and a bulk of which should be exported, and India can export its way towards its growth. How that will be done? How have we come this far? I have a unique panel that will get you expertise on the government side and the legal side both, and also on the WTO end, because a lot of disputes regarding to exports, dumping issues, duties end up there. So may I welcome Ma'am Aruna Sharma. As we all know, Ma'am has served as Secretary to the Government of India. And good to see you, and looking forward to some very interesting interventions from you. I have with me Jayant Dasgupta, who served as India's ambassador to the WTO. Good to see you again, and looking forward to some good interventions. I have with me Senior Advocate Rohan Shah, who's a Advocate Rohan Shah. He's an advocate at the Supreme Court of India, and also is India's nominee governor to IRIA, an Asian trade policy think tank. And he has also worked with successive commerce ministers on different trade policy and especially trade litigation issues. He will come on that side on the show today. Good to see you, Mr. Shah, and looking forward to some good inputs from you today. At the outset, may I request Mr. Rohan Shah to first lay the ground of today's topic in terms of the export figure of $400 billion and put it in perspective of what's happened in the past 3-4 years before we go ahead with the opening comments.
Yeah, thank you, Tarun, and a pleasure to be part of this panel. Tarun, the much celebrated figure, where we've gone past the 400 billion on merchandise export, and that coupled with almost in excess of 250 billion in the context of service exports. But just focused on the merchandise export, I think the scale of progress is probably best illustrated by the fact that if you see the preceding financial year, the growth was in excess of 35% in merchandise exports. And if you see the current financial year, then that has been in excess of 44%. And on what is already a significant base, to achieve this rate of percentage progress, I think has been quite remarkable. And the issue, of course, is that in the manner in which we are now poised, this seems to be a takeoff point rather than the fact that, we've reached some sort of pinnacle, because as you know, in international trade, for a long time, the mantra was globalization. Over the last 10 odd years, that is sort of reversing because nations are becoming more insular. They're looking more to buy within the nation and sell within the nation. Having said which, there is still, of course, a tremendous import dependence, depending upon the relative efficiencies of different nations. And before now, the market in the import-export trade was largely driven by what one would think of as pure commercial factors, which was price, quality, and the fact that you had a large, diversified manufacturing base. Events of the last 3 years have, of course, added another very important dimension, which is that the nation you trade with must also be a credible nation and an acceptable nation internationally, coupled with the fact that it has diversified and strong manufacturing base. And I think that's where India really ticks the box, that we are a credible nation to deal with. We are a democracy, and we have a large and diversified manufacturing base. And yes, we need to probably work towards our quality issues. But as things stand today, with China under a cloud, with Russia under a cloud as potential exporters, I think we are uniquely placed to progress beyond this 400 billion and progress very quickly from there.
Thank you for that laying the ground comment. I'll go to Ma'am Aruna Sharma. Two very important ministries which you, in a sense, held: steel, communications, and IT. Now, steel covers the manufacturing aspect. Communications and IT covers technically what we call non-merchandise exports. Could you share this journey? Because in the recent years, you've been part of both ministries.
Mr. Shah has really set the ground with numbers, figures, and the reasons behind it so beautifully. I'd like to work upon it that if you look at the metal sector, then starting from raw material to metals, especially in the lockdown period, when the Indian domestic market was slipping down, a new window was opened in the export market by them. And the companies, it became like a heart burning, because during the lockdown period, as the blast furnaces were working, the steel was being made, they entered and created a new export market. And that is where in the metals, as well as the raw material of iron ore, we see China emerged as a major market where we export it. And if you look at the IT service sector, then of course, if you look at the telecommunication manufacturing, which is going up year on year. And the beautiful part about it is since 19, 20, 21, 22 figures, if we see, year on year, the percentage rise is in 2-digit. So it is reaching a sustainable level. And we have established a market in places like United States, China, UAE for agriculture goods, Hong Kong, Germany. So it's a very good, strong market we are entering into. And that has been the major issue. The MSMEs, they have also gone in a very big way, thanks to e-commerce platform. If you look at it, in textiles, we entered surprisingly into the bed linen and towels into the European Union market. And India has become a lead seller thanks to the e-commerce platforms, which provided all logistics as well as an entry into the new market. So the adoption of e-commerce technology, the adoption of entering into the new market, the adoption of introducing your product into the new market, all these three combined together has made it possible for us to go ahead, along with the emphasis of the government that make in India and enhance the exports. And especially from MSME, from 48, we have reached 48, we have to reach 60%. All that is going to work hand in hand. And therefore, it is very important that after this, we have to tread very carefully that policies are completely conducive to the path which has been chosen or a market which has been established. Here, I'll put a negative mark that like Goa mining, we lost the international market. So we don't want to lose the market that we have created because any policy hiccups. And that is where we have to tread very carefully.
Okay. Goa mining is an important point that you mentioned. I go to Ambassador Jain Dasgupta. Mr. Dasgupta, while at the WTO, you were in a sense in the action of various trade disputes that end up there. Of course, the solar panel dispute was much discussed a few years ago. What are the roadblocks you foresee? Because a lot of non-tariff barriers to exports are put by many countries. And India experienced those in the past few years. Where standards are used as a barrier to exports and imports by those countries. Could you share your experience and how to go forward from this 400 billion to 1 trillion?
Well, that's a very interesting question that you have asked, Tarun, because increasingly tariffs are not going to be, important barriers to trade. Because most of the developed countries, as well as some of the major developing countries, have reduced their tariffs to low levels, fairly low levels. Now, non-tariff barriers, of course, can be of different kinds. And if you broadly separate them into two categories, one would be those relating to standards, and the other one relating to various kinds of procedures and certifications, which could be, for instance, if you export something, before the exports, you would have to obtain a certification from the importing country agency. Now, that is a kind of a non-tariff barrier, and sometimes the fees for the same are very high, which act as a deterrent to exports. So if you look at the standards issue which you raised specifically, in agriculture products, there are three important agencies. One is the plant quarantine agency. The other one is called OIE, and the third one is Codex Alimentarius. So for processed foods, the standards are set by Codex Alimentarius, of which India is also a member. Now, if you want to have standards above the Codex Alimentarius standards, then you have to assign reasons why you are doing so. And these could be in the form of threats to human or animal health, etc. Similarly, for animal products and for plant quarantine, etc. Now, the issue is that, for instance, we were exporting grapes to the European Union, and we found that the pesticide residue level in our grapes was much higher than the prescribed standards. Now, that is something which you have to live by. You can't really call it a non-tariff barrier, because if it has been proved to be dangerous for human health, the kind of pesticides that we see in the grape cultivation, even in India, we are advised that we should soak the grapes for at least 6 to 8 hours before we consume them. So that is the kind of thing which we'll have to adapt to. We will have to improve not only in agricultural products, but in all other products, for instance, electrical products. Now, in the case of the US, they don't have a national standard setting body of the government. They have private standards by and large. So if you want to sell something, it will have to undergo certain tests, and the accreditation will probably have to come from some agency in the US. So this is the kind of thing, and of course the fees would be quite high. So these are the kind of things which would be there. Of course, there are some standard setting bodies in the case of non-agricultural products also. And but the point is, those are non-mandatory. So if you don't adhere to them, it's not that you can't export. But in the case of Codex Alimentarius, for instance, processed food, most countries would set that as the lower limit. That is the minimum that you have to.
That's a good point. I'll now take this question to Mr. Rohan Shah. Mr. Shah, three sectors rather. Auto components, we continue to do exceedingly well. That's asset. Gems and jewelry, in which you also work a lot. India does very well in that sector. Agri exports, of course, have been good. From 400 billion to 1 trillion, this will have to grow manifold, all these three sectors. What are the roadblocks that need to be addressed in your view? Because, of course, there will be roadblocks, because we will, in the end up eating some other country's pie as we grow. I was reading up for this episode and found out that US imports peeled garlic in excess of $1 billion from China. So finished and peeled garlic can also be a $1 billion export, is a revelation. So even small things can be big exports. But your answer on these three sectors?
Yeah. Tarun, all of these sectors have, of course, contributed significantly to the numbers we have today. But there is always the possibility that you will have an outlier event which will disrupt your short-term prospects. So in gems and jewelry, for example, some amount of our sourcing was from Alrosa in Russia. Okay. And the US markets, as part of their trade sanctions, because of the recent war, have taken a stance that no Russian origin goods will be acceptable. Now, this is despite the fact that there is a very substantial transformation and value addition in India. Even if we talk of cut and polished diamonds, and if we talk of jewelry, then, even greater. But you will, from time to time, have these challenges. But if we look at the larger canvas, firstly, I think we have a huge amount of experience of things which have been roadblocks, whether it has been our export benefits, which have been actioned, as being non-sustainable under the WTO regime, whether it has been the sort of standards issues that we have faced, as Mr. Dasgupta mentioned. I think we have a really rich history of knowing the challenges which can come up And I think we have the dexterity to deal with those because we've successfully dealt with them. And I think when government and the private sector comes together, there is then the opportunity to open all these doors. And let me give you a recent example. Typically we see anti-dumping as something which is invasive and will cause us to lose market share. But there is another way of looking at it. Very, very recently, beddings, what we call gaddas in India, that market in the US, there was an anti-dumping proceeding. The 5 top exporters all had an anti-dumping duty in excess of 200%, which means that a close to $8 billion market annually, and therefore if you multiply over 5 years, just opened up. And we are really one of the nations who does have the capacity. So if we are thinking proactively to not only look at educating ourselves on problems we faced, but the opportunities which are continuously being thrown up for our sectors, then I think that's really the approach which is going to get us to these numbers as quickly as we can. And I think the other truth which we must square up to is the factor that, we have to invest tremendously in ensuring that the quality of our product really makes a massive upgrade. So just as in services, we are the byword for credibility and consistency, the same thing has to happen in merchandise. And for that, we have to spend both capital in innovation, capital in improvement. But if we do that, then I think, all of the predictable problems can be taken care of. The outlier events like this war will affect you maybe for 6 months or a year, but in the long run, you will get over it. And I think given how proactive our government has been, our minister has been with industry, I think we have a lot of learning which can open up a lot of doors for us, doors that we previously thought were shut.
Okay, that's a good point. I'll go to Ma'am Aruna Sharma at this point. Ma'am, look at the existing infrastructure that is there in India. And look at China, where there are the special economic zones right at the ports, port cities that are meant only for export. Do you think that going forward, India can achieve $1 trillion exports without having these port cities? Because of course, for auto components, we have had all that development at Chennai, Pune. But for other sectors, do you think we will need these port cities in future?
It goes like this. Instead of creating new, it's a question of declaring the clusters which are existing today even in the hinterland as a special economic zones, or making them export friendly by giving them the dry ports and other kinds of facilities so that they are able to enter the markets. And that becomes the fastest way to enter into it. And that also enables us to do the testing facilities there so that they are able to maintain the standards of the country where they are exporting, as well as they are able to take the advantage of coming together of the similar product manufacturers to have a better bargaining power of placing their product or finding a new market. So this kind of a thing, even though they are competing with each other, there are many things which they do together. And it also helps them because another non-tariff barrier which will be used against us when any country wants to needle us further will be on the carbon footprint. Therefore, it is very, very important for our country to lay our own standards, how much we want to walk the way and how many years we will take to adhere to the maybe COP26 or Paris principles, so that when we are in the export market, we say, okay, this is our roadmap and this is how we plan to go. So that is what is going to make a difference. So it is not necessary to create these zones. And like in e-commerce also, we say you declare SEZ as the e-commerce special zones also, so that those people can board on those platforms and straight away go ahead and introduce the products to the new market. Now, today, the advantage that we have is that we do have manufacturing. We understand the quality. We have technology to test it in the market, to get a real-time feedback and maybe scale it up depending on the demand of a specific market. So with this, all these things lay out and the government giving literally a clarion call that export is going to be one of our major things in the manufacturing world, I think that is how we proceed.
Okay. I'll go to Ambassador Jain Das Gupta at this point. what kind of disputes do you foresee going forward as India rises from 400 billion to 1 trillion? Because they say the real games begin when you emerge as a major player, not when you are about 2% of the world market, but when you're aiming for a much higher share now. And how should we be planning to tackle this?
If you look at the major economies, China, for instance, or the US or the European Union as a whole, you will see that the major disputes in the WTO, they all fall into a few slots only. And one of them is about subsidies. The kind of subsidies that, for instance, China was giving in some form, or the other. And most of them were not being notified to the WTO. They were being given at the federal level initially. Then when disputes arose, they were shifted to the state level and then finally to the city level and to SEZs, which you started giving them to enterprises on a one-on-one basis. Now, that is the kind of thing which we will also face, provided we also start subsidizing in the same way. But the other schemes that we have put together, for instance, the PLI scheme, which we have tried to be very cautious about not infringing any WTO discipline, that also could come into question, but we are very confident that it will sail through and it would be found to be WTO consistent. So the first part is about subsidies. The second part is about trade defense measures, which include subsidies, but which also includes anti-dumping, for instance, that you are cross-subsidizing in some way, not only through subsidies, but by selling at a higher price in other markets or even in your own domestic market, and selling in a new market at a lower price so that you penetrate the market first, and then you start reaping the benefits of near monopoly. So that is something also which we will be soon seeing happening if we indeed keep progressing in the same way and have double-digit growth for our exports. So these are 2 or 3 things which we have to keep ourselves really nimble about. One point which I wanted to mention, and that's a very good point which Mr. Rohan Shah mentioned, that is that, for instance, for mattresses, $8 billion worth of goods came under scrutiny and were subject to anti-dispute action. Now, you have to be very nimble and you have to have a broad base, because some opportunity or the other may crop up, but you may not have a good enough or a large enough industry to cater to the requirements of an importing country. So do we have that kind of a broad, diversified base of the requisite standard? Because again, standards will come into play. So this is something which we need to build up, especially in areas where there is a large amount of trade taking place. And electronics is one in which of various kinds of products, components, assemblies, finished products, there is a lot of increase in the overall activity, and it has been estimated that very soon about 40% of the global trade in merchandise goods would have some component or the other of electronics embedded in them, or they would be pure electronic goods.
Point well taken. I'll go to Mr. Rohan Shah now. 3 things that come to my mind whenever we say this journey from $400 billion to $1 trillion. A, cost of capital in India. Then your logistics cost. Third, reliable electricity and the power cost. And fourth, the duties that we put for goods that are imported as raw materials but go into export goods for us. Because many times we end up putting up duties on these raw material imports that are then used in, and a lot of industries are complaining. Do you think that we will have to, in the next 7 years, get around these 4 things so that, we can see the true growth that we want to 1 trillion, and your views on it?
Tarun, I think rightly identified, cost of capital is always going to be a key concern in terms of international competitiveness. And therefore, our policies in terms of availability of capital and the cost of capital for those units which are our exporting units, I think is going to be a key issue. I don't think the issue of the import duties for what we then use for export is a key concern, because in some form or manner we neutralize it. If it is in a SEZ or a EOU, then of course you don't pay anything. But in another instance, you effectively get duty drawbacks. The fact that duty drawbacks are often delayed, of course, is a concern, because it in a way indirectly impacts our competitiveness. So from my perspective, it's going to be really three things besides the factors that you said. I think we are going to need to have a policy which is very, very agile in the context of, what we want to achieve, because some of our policies, will need to be long-term and constant and strong. At another level, of course, we will have to be, as Mr. Dasgupta put it, nimble. But that agility in terms of people literally looking around for matching global opportunity with our capability or building capability, I think is going to be key. So policy is going to be key. And the taxation policy, the fiscal policy is part of that. The second is, I think for us to have sustainable ambitions, we have to have an improvement of quality. And, our products have to be known for quality and predictability. And I think the government is rightly sort of focused, on that. And I think the last thing is going to be infrastructure. The ability to move goods, whether they're from clusters or SEZs or, even from the hinterland, quickly to ports and to move raw materials and intermediaries from ports to our production capabilities, I think is going to be key. And, this interconnectivity of really transportation, which is ships, with rail, with road, I think nimble, cheap mobility, along with quality and along with, more supportive, proactive policy, really can take us to the target and probably even beyond. Because like I said, we are uniquely placed. We are welcome in every part of the world, which you can't say for most of our competitors, including China and Hong Kong.
That's a good point, but India still does not dominate the global shipping lines. India is dependent on shipping lines owned by majorly all foreign countries. They end up blocking our exports sometimes for more than 60 days. And a lot of small scale guys are all out on social media saying my shipment is stuck for 60 days. My contract in Germany is getting cancelled. When we hear these kind of appeals, we really feel powerless. And that's why, ma'am, Aruna Sharma, how do we get around this? Because building up shipping lines can't happen in a day. But the other guys who have them can definitely trouble us within a day. When they decide to trouble us, they can create these barriers which are the small guys can't compete with.
I'll put it this way. One is, of course, internal, as has been mentioned by both co-panelists, of having a credible, sustainable, and sort of a long-term policies, not a flip-flop kind of an arrangements. Then in the IT world, it is very easy and convenient to do the book adjustments for the export of the input-output credits. But unfortunately, there are delays. So that is something we can easily overcome. In shipment, when there is a conglomerate of them and containers are being used and you are using, and I repeat again, the e-commerce platforms, then this ship arrangements can be taken care of. These delays, if we are a prompt payer and a fast payer, then, they don't mess around much with us. We have seen it in metals that we did export steel quite to a considerable extent, and we plan to double it up in coming 10 years. So it is going to happen because on the domestic consumption will go up as well as the exports will go up. Same is happening in textiles, same will happen in agriculture products. So it all happens is how quick our custom clearances is and how long the ship has to wait there, both the emptying of the ship and refilling of the ship.
Yes.
So these are some of the things, if we take care of it, we will not have an issue of having these kind of a blockades, because intentional blockades get highlighted. which may be one of the rare cases. Maximum of the delays happen because some problem is on our side as well. So that is something we can always take care of when we are moving on these issues. Equally important is that in the entire logistic chain, unfortunately, we want to have a profit at every value addition. And that is something there is a need to relook, which I always emphasize that if we are able to revive some of the sectors because we had an holistic approach and we ensured that it's not a cost addition at every stage. So it is very, very important, especially where the products are going in the export sector. There is a need to do a reverse engineering into the addition of the cost, which can be done away with for us to be continued competitive in the export market. And that is what is going to make the whole difference. Of course, parallelly, we have to continue to have our own shipping industry. But that's a long-term goal. That's a long-term goal.
Mr. Dasgupta, 2-3 points, but very quickly, because we're almost out of time, you and Mr. Shah, then we close. Point number one, if you look at China, it became a part of the ASEAN value chain in the early 1990s. And so you could see a lot of value addition happening in China for products which may have been manufactured earlier by Malaysia or by South Korea. India missed being part of that value chain which was created. Now to enter it is late. We saw some action from the government on the mobile phones front where it said that no to imports, we'll put duties. You'll have to put manufacturing units here. How can India now integrate into that value chain, or do you think that India should chart now a completely different path for itself? Because electronics is still a huge chunk of our imports.
That's absolutely true. Now, if you look at value chains, you'll find that there is always a lead firm which owns the intellectual property and which is marketing the final product. You know, even in the case of Apple, for instance, Apple doesn't have a factory. It's all made by its suppliers. Then it is put together by the final supplier and it is sold. So Apple is owning the intellectual property. Now, if you look at, as you mentioned, Southeast Asia and China, there was a foreign firm, either of European origin or the US origin firm, which found out that the manufacturing costs in China were lower than that of Southeast Asia in the 90s. And China very quickly built up large capacities, which brought down the prices even more of manufacturing. Now, that is what happened. Then the Chinese firms themselves gained in scale and they became the lead firms. And now they have started farming out their manufacturing, etc., into Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, Malaysia, etc. So that is one model of growth. Now, unless a lead firm comes to India and sets up base here, and that is exactly what I think you are mentioning when you said about mobile phones. We want the lead firms to come to India, bring in their suppliers who may be located in China, Vietnam, other parts of the world, to come and set up base in India. And that is happening because of the PLI scheme in a great measure. So we are indeed on that path. The point is we must back a system or a set of policies which helps India in backing or in producing world champions, which is the model which Korea followed of Kaibols. Now, that is what we need to do in a few chosen sectors to start with, then we can expand the base. So once we do that, those firms, the world champions, they would then be the lead firms and they would set up their ancillary industries. This is exactly what happened in the case of, for instance, autos. Maruti came and set up its base here. Of course, it was owned 51% by the government, but then it divested. But after that, other firms came in from all over the world and they set up their manufacturing base and then followed the ancillarization of the industry. And
now, going from one final comment from Mr. Rohan Shah, give me a 3-point wish list that you have for export growth, which you think are things which can be tackled easily, not the big agendas, but the quick things that you can do.
Yeah, look, I think first and foremost is a question of clear intent. And I think we have to see this as our biggest opportunity in the public-private space. In this case, the fact of an active, ambitious joint venture between government, its policy, its administration, and private industry, and keeping that sustained over a period of 20, 30 years, I think to me is the absolute key. The other situation is, of course, our focus in terms of periodic opportunities that we will keep getting all over the world, and gearing our industry to be best positioned to take advantage of those. And lastly, I think the situation for us is going to be the aspect of ease of capital and the infrastructure, which is the critical import-export infrastructure. For us to be a real player, our dependencies have to drop, and we have to grow in terms of sustainable assets we have. And I think the last is we are the market we are. And for all the global intellectual property leaders, if they want to sell to us, then they certainly should also add value in India when they sell out to the rest of the world. And I think if we can harness these 3 or 4, then really there's nothing which should stop us 1 trillion and beyond.
Looking forward to this part 2 of this discussion. We have congratulated the government on achieving the $400 million target, but from the next shows that we do, we will take up sector-specific issues and sector-specific expectations, because I think auto components, gems and jewelry, and there are a few other sectors in which India can claim leadership in the world. And that is where I think we would also like to discuss more and get more viewpoints from the industry, so that it can be an interesting discussion. But that's it for now. Thank you so much, Mr. Rohan Shah, Ma'am Aruna Sharma, Mr. Jayan Das Gupta, for sparing time and joining us on this really important issue that involves all of us. And looking forward to see you all again on our sector-specific series. But bye for now. Thank you so very much.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.